How's everyone doing today?
Great.
Good. Awesome. Great. Tired? Who is tired? Yes, all of us are. Some of us are good. Awesome. So last time when I started, I opened with a story about my childhood, and I want to open with one again. And I want to tell you about my grandfather. The thing I remember about him the most, and that I remember hearing about him the most, was his stories from World War II. My mom and my uncle would tell me a lot about him growing up. And the one story that stuck out to me the most was his story from D-Day. Him, along with many other soldiers, stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, and he was a 16-year-old boy when he did this. And I've always just looked up to that story and just seen bravery. And it just stuck out to me so much because I can't imagine the fear that they had, or the opposition that they faced, and the bravery that was needed. And within war, we're guaranteed to face opposition, just like my grandfather and the Canadian soldiers would have fought opposition that day. And it's a soldier's job to fight for their country, opposed to anything standing against their country. And I want us to see today that we too are at war, with many things opposed to the one that we serve, and that's God. So my main point today that I want to draw on is that we must oppose anything that stands against God. So the three ways that I'm going to do this today is that we oppose, the three ways that we do this are by opposing the enemy's status, tactics, and their disobedience. But before I go any further, turn with me to 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 to 6, and I'll be reading out of the NIV translation. So that's 2 Corinthians 10, 3 to 6. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. So to give some background and context on our passage, the last time I spoke, I was in 2 Corinthians 12, just a couple chapters ahead, and it was Paul's weaknesses in light of Christ's power. That passage was the climax of the defense of his ministry against the false apostles. And chapters 10 to 13, as I went over, served as rhetoric against the false apostles that he was facing. But today, I want to go to the beginning of his defense. So I'm in verses 3 to 6 of chapter 10. And we need to see that there's clear military and war imagery used. And he's pointing this back to his rivals at Corinth. He's teaching the Corinthians how to defend against the false apostles because they have waged a war against Paul. Their objective is to undermine the loyalty of the Corinthians to Paul. And this passage is a call to battle. It's a call for the Corinthians, and it's a call for us. And it's our job, as my main point states, to oppose anything that stands against God. So the first way that we oppose anything that stands against God is by opposing the enemy's status. So in verse 3 it says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." So status, by status I mean a spiritual status, is the enemy we are opposing for or against God. So we have the world in this passage. For though we live in the world. The world's status is opposed to God. And Paul clearly sets himself apart from the world. We do not act as the world does. We see that in the very first words, for though. He's distincting himself. The status is different. For though we live in the world. And versus us, our status as Christians is we live in the world, but not as the world. And he shows this that through how we wage war. We don't wage war as the world does. So how do we not wage war as the world does? In verse 4, first part of verse 4, he says that the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. So what are these weapons? How do they differ from that of the world's? They're not physical, but they're spiritual. And commentators speculate what these weapons are. There's the gospel of Christ, prayer, scripture, love, and the power of the Spirit. And the two I'm going to focus on are the gospel and the power of Christ today. And Paul is also making another distinction. If we look in the second half of verse 4, he says, "Our weapons are not that of the world, but on the contrary, They have divine power to demolish strongholds. So the status of our enemy is clear in this passage. The weapons of our enemy rank lesser than ours, because if they're opposing God, they're fighting as the world. And if they're fighting as the world does, they're using different weapons from us. And Paul alludes to the fact that the weapons of the enemy rank lesser than ours, because our weapons have divine power. And we see, on the contrary, he uses that in verse 4. It's clear that the world does not have this divine power in their weapons. And it's a power which Paul states can demolish strongholds. And these strongholds that Paul's talking about are where Paul's enemies have laid siege to his ministry from. These are strongholds of the mind, reasoning opposed to God's word. And this is an attitude of the world and a campaign against God that Paul stood opposed to. And he is waging war against that attitude of the world. So we understand our enemy's status that we need to oppose. It's lesser than ours in terms of weapons, and it is spiritually opposed to God because they fight as the world does. And Paul assumes that we fight with weapons that are not of this world. So he brings us into that camp. He brings the Corinthians into that camp. And so when we fight with weapons that are not of this world, we must oppose the worldly and lesser status of our enemies. And opposing the enemy's status is the first way that we oppose anything that stands against God. And the second way that we do this is by opposing the enemy's tactics. So in verse 5, the first part of verse 5, it says, "We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God." So arguments and pretensions. If you look, you see in the end of verse 4, it says strongholds, and then these arguments and pretensions. One commentator proposes that those are interchangeable, that they are one and the same, that the strongholds that these enemy uses are the arguments and pretensions, that he's just elaborating on his point. And these arguments and pretensions that set themselves up against the knowledge of God are the enemy's tactics that we must oppose. And the false apostles, they set themselves up against the gospel, against the knowledge of God. And that's the purpose of their tactics. And what the false apostles were preaching was counterfeit to Paul's gospel. And so it was a necessity that Paul calls us to oppose these. And by saying that we demolish these tactics, is for Paul to say that we oppose them. But how do we demolish? Paul brings out our ultimate weapon in this. He says that we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. We know the status of our enemy. They're of the world. They're lesser than our status before God. And the tactics of our enemies, they are weak, they're feeble, and they're therefore easy to oppose. And so we take captive every thought because the goal of Paul's battle is obedience to Christ, and his tactic being every thought being made captive. And the reason for his war imagery is this, and this needs to be our tactic as well. So for our modern context, anything in our lives that is standing against God must be opposed. So maybe this is lust, bitterness, anger, jealousy, rage, things you're dealing with in your life that is sin that makes you hostile to God. It sets itself against the knowledge of God and the gospel in our own lives. By not submitting these things to Christ, we live as prisoners of this enemy, of this weaker enemy, and it doesn't make sense. I imagine sitting in a jail cell, and you're holding the key, but you don't open the door. You just sit there. You sit there and you choose to sit in prison. These things which wage war, they have lesser standing and lesser power than us. So why do we stay there? Why do we stay in chains, in sin, when we have the weapons to fight against these things? So we take captive every thought, which is our ultimate tactic, and we make them obedient to Christ. These strongholds have no place in our lives, and so they must be opposed. Because, as my main point states, anything that stands against God must be opposed. Even in these times, we are still children of God. We haven't lost that status. But if we're living in these strongholds, we're not living in the freedom and victory that's rightfully ours. And we're choosing against that. So we must oppose our enemy's tactics. And the third way that we oppose anything that stands against God is by opposing our enemy's disobedience. So the last verse in the passage says, "We will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete." Disobedience to God had no place in Paul's context. He ensured that the Corinthians knew there were consequences for disobedience, and this consequence was punishment. Paul's war campaign is simple: obedience to Christ. And once he demolishes his enemy's strongholds, these tactics, he'll punish those who are remaining rebellious. But he's patient with the Corinthians. Those who have rebelled have the chance to repent, and the congregation as a whole has a chance to submit themselves to Christ. And for our modern context, we need to understand that there's consequences for our disobedience. Probably not the same as would be the Corinthian situation, but this needs to motivate us to live in obedience to God and oppose that which stands against God. And there's encouragement found in verse 6. It says, once your obedience is complete. That obedience is an ongoing process. We don't have to get it right away. And the Corinthians hadn't even fully attained obedience. It's not okay to disobey, but obedience takes time. We don't need to give up when we mess up. We have tools and we have tactics that God has given us to be obedient to Him, and we need to submit what sets itself against God over to Christ. So, as I close today, I'll give us 3 ways that we can apply this to our lives. The first way is, what are the strongholds in our lives? We're all students in this room. So maybe we're dealing with anxiety, really chronic anxiety, or we have addictions or coping mechanisms in our lives that we deal with this stress. Maybe we're dealing with doubt or apathy as we're just in this end of the semester and we just can't handle the pressure. Maybe we're in high pressure disciplines like music or athletics. We're setting high and unrealistic expectations of ourselves that not even God is expecting of us. We expect perfection. Maybe we're in a position of leadership. We're facing opposition from others. We're doubting ourselves. We're doubting what God can do in our lives. Maybe we have family or relational tensions, and we feel the weight of those. We feel these strongholds take place in our lives. These must be opposed because they set themselves against God, and we need to make them obedient to Christ. And the second way is that we need to see that our own minds can be hostile and disobedient to God. So by taking captive every thought to the obedience of Christ, this is an act of worship. We can offer and submit our body to God in this. And by the Spirit of God in us, which is our divine weapon, we have the power to submit our minds. We're called to freedom, and we've been equipped for this freedom. And finally, the third way is we need to be confident in God and what He can do. He's equipped us with His Word and His Spirit. We can fight against what wages war inside of us. And when we submit these things to God, we make our enemy obedient to Christ. And this enemy can be ourselves at times. So He has the final word, and He will win the battle for us. Thanks.
Are you guys all still feeling tired? Because if you are, just stand